Welcome everybody to Microsoft 365 Copilot Readiness Planning and Roadmap. Hot topic these days. Been seeing a lot of interest from folks around this. So for those of you that don't know me, Peter Carson, President of Envision IT, also a Microsoft MVP and an industry speaker. Actually gave this talk 2 weeks ago in Oslo and also in Stockholm. There was a Collab Days community conference in Oslo on a Saturday. So traveled through there and then continued on to Stockholm for ESPC, the European SharePoint Conference, which is probably the biggest Microsoft 365 focused conference in Europe. Really well run and well attended, a couple thousand people for that. So that was a lot of fun. Had never been to either country before. Didn't get a chance to see either of them too much, although tacked a couple of days on the end of Stockholm to actually get to see the city. So from an agenda, we're together for the next 45 minutes or so. I'll try and keep to the timing from that perspective. I'm actually going to start by talking about what was announced, talked about at Ignite, which is the big Microsoft conference, which is back in person again now. So they had it in Chicago. I think they had 10,000+ people in attendance, and obviously Copilot everywhere is a big theme from Microsoft. But really, we're focused on Microsoft 365 Copilot, which is one of the flavors of that. And I want to chat on some of the announcements and conversations that happen at Ignite around that. And then we'll dive into a readiness roadmap. Kind of got two roadmaps. There's one that Microsoft published at Ignite, maybe a little ambitious. I got some chuckles in Stockholm about that one, and then sort of a broader roadmap that we put together on our side. I'm going to jump to the end and then come back to this again at the end. The key takeaways that I want people to understand through this webinar is, kind of everybody knows AI is coming. It's either going to happen under your control or not. It's your decision if you're in an admin or a governance role at your organization as to what that looks like. But it's really important to understand that your data needs to be prepared before you turn on Copilot, and we'll talk about what that means and what that looks like from that point of view. And really, it starts with understanding what's going on today in your tenant, doing some reporting and analysis on that prior to just lighting it up from that perspective. So let's start with sessions at Ignite around Microsoft 365 Copilot. And there was quite a few sessions that they had. These are all available on demand, so you can go up onto the Microsoft Ignite site and just search for these sessions, and you can either some of them have presentations downloadable, some of them have the recordings there, the transcripts. I actually used Copilot to help me sort of digest all this content because I didn't have time to go through all of these sessions. I watched a number of them end to end, but I actually took the transcripts for a number and threw them into Copilot and said, give me a summary of the high points from this presentation. Actually pretty decent job of calling out what they talked about in that. And then I could decide, hey, do I want to go deeper and actually watch that recording and where do I go from there? But probably the two big ones for me was the very last one, actually, the Prepare Your Data for Microsoft Copilot. I've known Erica for a lot of years. She used to be an MVP before she joined Microsoft as a full-time employee. Actually got to know Dave in chat through LinkedIn back and forth after the session. He was great about providing the deck and answering questions for me around that. So that was one that I drew a lot of content from. And then this one here, also Erica, but Ben Summers as well. Ben was great as well in terms of responding back. Just understanding how Copilot works and how the prompt works. I'm not going to go into the level of detail that they spent in that whole session. If you're interested in that, I'd absolutely encourage you to check that one out. So this was a lot of new content from Microsoft from that perspective, and a lot of great content. So just to start with, is deploying Copilot like opening Pandora's box? And to a certain degree it is. I mean, yes, you can close the box again. You could turn Copilot off if maybe it's exposing sensitive or overshared content that it shouldn't be. We can talk about what that means and how you address that from that point of view. But it is something that there's obviously a lot of demand for, and you want to manage that demand appropriately. What you also want to do is make sure you don't, block it and close it down too much that people end around you and just go to shadow IT like ChatGPT public and start taking your enterprise data and throwing it up in the public domain, because that's a really bad idea. That data can end up in the training model and end up in the public domain. It's not secure from that point of view. So using large language models inside of the Microsoft service boundaries, it's a much better idea, and Copilot being the key one from that perspective. So I'm going to start with a slide from the actual Ignite session. It was sort of showcasing what can happen if things aren't done appropriately. And this actually isn't unique to Copilot. It's a broader search thing. It's a Delve thing. You know, there's a lot of scenarios where this can come up. So this is random person in an organization, you know, in the summertime saying, hey, are there any org changes happening next month? Just discreetly asking that question of Copilot. And then getting an answer back to say, hey, you know, here's some general information on organizational changes, but oh wait, there's this confidential Q2 reorg document of changes coming up on September 4th. And whoa, I wasn't actually part of those discussions, but because somebody didn't set permissions properly, I was able to discover that content through Copilot. And that's one of the big concerns around Copilot, is that oversharing has happened. People aren't aware of where permissions have been broken and overridden and who actually has access to the content. And like I said, this is not unique to Copilot, and it's not a problem with Copilot. It's actually a problem with your information governance and how you're managing permissions and access rights in your organization. And we saw this a lot a number of years ago when Delve first lit up. So for those of you not familiar with Microsoft Delve, it's actually going away. Microsoft is deprecating it. But a lot of the functionality that it had in it around knowledge discovery is still there in other parts of Microsoft 365. And you could go to somebody in Delve and get a sense of what they were working on. And that freaked a lot of people out because they felt, hey, somebody can look over my shoulder and see my work. No, they can only see your work that they're involved with. So if they have permissions to things that you're working on, Delve was a way to surface that up. And it was actually really valuable. You know, Logan's on the call. He's my VP sales. If he's working on a big proposal, I could go to his Delve page and see that sales proposal if I had access to it. And it's, you know, a quicker, easier way to do that than chatting Logan and saying, hey, can you send me the link to that sales presentation that you're working on? It's a way to discover knowledge within the organization. But if things have been overshared and I wasn't supposed to see that document, you know, it can light it up from that point of view. And I had more than one client call us in a panic to say, hey, we need to turn Delve off because it's showing, you know, management documents to the entire organization and it's freaking out the C-level team. Well, turning Delve off is not the solution to that, because it's actually still going to be there in Microsoft Search. It's still going to be discoverable. What you need to do is properly secure your content. And that's a big thing around the Copilot readiness, but it's actually a broader thing that you need to address within your organization. So let's talk for a minute, just, you know, how does Copilot actually answer a question like that? I'm not going to go deep into it. I've given some previous webinars on what's called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, which is how Copilot works. And it's not unique to Copilot. It's sort of an industry standard approach to providing agent type of experience. And the key here is that these large language models get trained on large data sets, and that's how they understand how to answer questions. Then they use the content in that data set to answer those questions. But that's a point in time. Like if you think back when ChatGPT was first taking off, you know, it was a copy of the internet sort of a year prior to that. So if you asked it questions about what happened next week, it had no idea of how to answer that because it wasn't part of its training model. So retrieval augmented generation say, let's combine that large language model with search and allow the agent to do a search on your behalf and get current content and then be able to answer the question with that content. So when you ask a question to Copilot, you're submitting what's called a prompt to the large language model. There's this piece of Copilot called the orchestrator. It sits in between the large language model and you and all of the content. And it basically says, hey, what do I need to answer this prompt? Like if you asked, can you summarize my emails from yesterday, which is actually a common use case I use Copilot for. It's awesome. I mean, it needs to go into my inbox and get yesterday's emails in order to answer that question. So it's using what's called Microsoft Graph to find that information. Graph lets the orchestrator go into my mailbox, into my Teams chats, into files that I have access to in Team sites or Teams and such, and pull that content back. And it basically adds it to the prompt and gives it to the large language model and says, here's all yesterday's emails, please summarize them for Peter. And the large language model will come back and say, hey, that wasn't in my training model, but you gave it to me as part of the prompt. I know how to answer that. And now here's a summary on your emails from there, which is a super useful use case for Copilot. The key is that Graph will use any content that it has access to as the person who's asking the question, in this case as me. And if I have access to something that maybe I'm not supposed to, Orchestrator doesn't know that, Graph doesn't know that, it'll just pull that content in and answer that question like that org chart question that we just had. So that's where it's important to make sure, hey, do we have the right structure in there from that point of view? I mean, this is a deeper slide of how that's working and how the orchestrator can go through Graph to get to your files, to your emails, to your team chats. It can actually go out into your line of business data, into public Bing data, into your enterprise data. You know, there's lots you can do to kind of extend Copilot around this, but it's all basically working on the same model, that there's some sort of search happening, and the results of that search is going into the large language model. So that second session that I called out really goes deep into how this works and where the service boundary is and where the privacy is and such. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to check that out. Okay, so this term oversharing is something you'll hear a lot from a Copilot readiness point of view, not just from me. You know, too much access and too few controls are the issue here. That, you know, things have been over permissioned and people have access maybe to content that they shouldn't, and we don't have the controls in place to look for those from that perspective. You know, and it's really a byproduct of collaboration. Microsoft's done a great job of making it easy to share documents, sites, you know, content from my OneDrive for Business, from SharePoint sites, adding people to Teams channels and Teams and such through the share links in there. And I'm a big fan of that. But sort of overusing that and not tidying that up after the fact can be a danger from that point of view. So if we think about, you know, what are the common causes of Copilot oversharing, specific to SharePoint and documents, which is where a lot of our focus is. So one of them is the site privacy. So when I create a Microsoft team or a team site in SharePoint, I have a choice of calling it a public or a private team or a site. And the difference between that, public, anybody in the organization can access that site. Not guests, not external people, but anybody who's a member account that works for your organization has access to the site. And some sites make a lot of sense. You know, we build lots of intranets for clients, and your staff portal, your staff intranet, everybody in the organization should have access to it. And it makes sense to set that one as public. And there may be others that it makes sense for that, but others, you know, private probably makes more sense for that perspective. And it depends on the type and size of organization and style. You know, I like to think about us as an organization and what's our sharing style with our staff as a whole. And we're more of a default by, open by default type of company. What that means is, you know, generally we don't restrict access to something unless there's a valid reason for people not to see that. Just the fact that you're not working on a particular client's project, we don't block you from seeing that project. Everybody in the company has access to all of our client sites and all of our project sites, because we want people to be able to discover and say, hey, even if I wasn't involved in that project, maybe there was something interesting that was done there that I can use on this project that I am working on. So let's keep that open. So that's sort of default by open. So things that we make private would be our management team, our finance team, our HR team, things that obviously, you know, do need to be private, and a smaller set of the organization needs to have access to it. Other often bigger organizations have the opposite approach to say, hey, if you don't have a need to work with this, then we're not going to give you access to that. You know, a common example there, we work with a number of law firms. You know, legal matters are something that are typically embodied in a folder or a site, and really only the staff working on that particular matter should have access to that. In fact, there's often a very strong requirement when you get into a bigger global law firm, where, you know, one part of the firm may be one part of the case or one side of a contract negotiation, and the other maybe another part. So they're actually, you know, opposing counsel within the same matter. They would actually keep those as two matters, and they have to make sure that opposing doesn't have access to either side from that point of view. We went through that situation where we were, you know, doing some financing through BTC, the Business Development Bank of Canada, and their law firm was our law firm for doing the financing documents. But they had two teams. One acted on our behalf, one acted on BTC's behalf, and they had to keep those separate from that point of view. So you have to figure out what makes sense in your organization, and what is the privacy. You know, how much do you have set to public, and is that appropriate from that point of view? The next one is around the default sharing. This one drives me nuts because the ability when I'm sharing documents. So let's actually just come over into SharePoint for a minute here. And let's go to our marketing site. And let's actually use this event as an example. So we've got a library for all of our events, and we keep all our documents related to that. So if I go into this webinar itself, we can see registration forms and this presentation. Let's say I wanted to share this presentation. So I can click the share link here. If I don't pay attention to this and I just copy the link, I don't necessarily understand what that link is doing. Now, this particular site, and this is something we try and do in all of our sites, defaults to people with existing access. So if I click the little gear here, there's different options around how the sharing works. I don't know why Microsoft did this, but we can't set this as a tenant default for every site to begin with. So we have to go through each site as we create it and make sure we set it to that one. Because this one, in my mind, should be the default in every organization. It doesn't change any permissions. It just allows me to create a link for people that already have access to it. And it's actually a really common scenario. Let's say I wanted to chat Logan the link to this deck. I would do this, I would copy this link, I would paste it into a Teams chat, and I would send it to him. And I know I haven't changed any permissions as part of that. Logan already has access to it. He just, I don't want him struggling to try and find it. I'm going to send him the deep link right to it. That did that for me. If I do any of the other choices here, like I say, people in Envision IT or anyone or people I choose, I'm actually changing the permissions on that PowerPoint presentation. So this is what you need to be careful with. People start doing this thinking, hey, I need to send this link out to people, but suddenly I've broken permissions. And if you don't set an expiration, which a lot of people don't do by default, that link is there forever. And that's where you can get into problems from that point of view, particularly if it's organization wide, where you can say, hey, I'm going to share it with everybody in the organization. It's kind of like making it public, or even anyone, which is anybody who has that link can access that document. That one sounds scary, but it's actually useful in a number of scenarios where I want to share it out with some people. I want to make sure that they're authenticated to come in, but I don't want to necessarily add or remove each individual person onto that. And I can set an expiry on that. I can set it so it's can't be downloaded, so I can control that much better than if I was just adding that as an attachment to an email, for example. So these are all very useful, but I strongly encourage clients to set that as the default. And ideally, you've got some sort of governance tool in place. We'll talk in a minute about different tools that can set that by default automatically for you as you're going through. So that's a big one. We're often seeing a lot of sharing links and maybe quite old through there. And I'm going to show our own tenant. We're not any better. We've got some serious cleanup to do from that point of view. But even if I don't do that sharing, I can break permissions to say, hey, at this spot in this library, I want different permissions in here. And generally, we want to discourage that. We don't want people doing that too much because you kind of forget about it and it becomes a mess to try and manage it. I mean, there are scenarios where it makes a lot of sense. In fact, our client sites that we create for each of our clients, we do this for a valid reason. We say, hey, we're going to give them read access to their client site as a whole. We have a private documents folder where we keep stuff that's just for our eyes only. So we're going to remove their rights from that one. So we break inheritance there. And we have a projects folder where we want them to actually be able to collaborate. We're going to break it again there and switch them from read only to contribute. So we do that on every client site. So we have a lot of broken permissions from that point of view. But where we go beyond that, that's where we have to look out and say, hey, did we do that right? Have we messed things up from that perspective? You can share with a group called Everyone Except External Users. This is a group that's sort of created by default in every tenant, and it means everybody who's not a guest, so all of your staff. It's kind of like setting it to public, but it's a different way of doing it. And you just have to be careful if that's being used. Has it been used appropriately? Was it done somewhere where maybe the content deeper under the folder where that permission was set actually isn't appropriate for public consumption? So you want to review those and understand what's been done from that point of view. And then the last piece is actually less to do with permissions. It's around sensitivity. And where this becomes important, because even though I have access to content, I should be aware of the sensitivity of that content before I use it in Copilot and do something else with it. Let me give you an example. So we work with a lot of healthcare agency, public sector hospitals, provincial health agencies. obviously there's the potential for a lot of personal health information in there, which is very high sensitivity. You have to treat that very appropriately. It should be encrypted. It should be restricted from sharing. Typically, there's rules that you want to have around that. But maybe you haven't gone too far with Microsoft Purview that we're going to talk about and applying labels to that content. When you ask a question of Copilot and you haven't labeled things, it has no idea what's high sensitivity and what's not. So it may suck up some, in that case, some personal health information and make it part of a PowerPoint presentation that you're going to give at a public forum. That's really not appropriate to share that kind of content in that forum. I mean, you would probably catch it and fix your slides up. But what would be better is, if you asked Copilot not to include highly sensitive content, or if there was a reason that you did want it, that it would actually label that presentation that it created from that high sensitivity content to itself being high sensitivity, which Copilot will do automatically for you if you've applied the labels properly. So we're seeing that most clients haven't rolled out an information protection plan, and that's something that we're strongly encouraging as part of a Copilot rollout. Which kind of leads me to the next slide here, which is around the tools that we have to address oversharing. And one obviously is Microsoft Purview, which is this big, compliance tool that does a lot of things. But one of the things it does is information protection and sensitivity, and that's really important from a Copilot perspective. But there's also this new tool called SharePoint Advanced Management, and it's an add-on to your base subscription that does provide some additional tools. It provides some reporting and some lifecycle and governance around that. So if we have a look, I think I've got a slide a little bit later where I'll dive into the actual reports. No, actually, let's go in there right now. So I'm going to stick with the theme of being very transparent and using our production tenant because it's got much more data in there. And I've set up SharePoint Advanced Management on our tenant and run some reports in there. So there's a number of reports here that looks for sharing links, looks for shared with everyone except external users, looks at sensitivity labels. So valuable, important information from that point of view. If I come into the sharing links reports, I'm not super impressed with this. Sorry, Microsoft, but the fact that it actually just looks for sharing links applied in the last 28 days, actually not too useful. Because if I go in here and I look at anyone links, it says, hey, there's 0 sites hitting that. I'm going to show you our tenant dashboard in a minute. There's a lot of sites that have anyone links. It's just that they were created longer ago than 28 days. So maybe this is useful for housekeeping once you've got your tenant clean, but it doesn't really help you get your tenant clean from that point of view. I mean, if I come down into the specific people, we actually see some sites there because we have created a few links, 7 sites with that. Some client sites and marketing, sales, things like that. So we do need to look at this and say, hey, why were we creating a specific people link for City of Windsor? They're an active client of ours, but they already have access through our external user manager. We should have been doing it that way. So there's some cleanup and house cleaning. But again, there's a lot more than 7 sites there. That's just what's been showing from the last 28 days. And it actually only shows me the top 100 sites here. I can download a detailed report if I had more than that, but it actually still doesn't give me any more detail than I see here. Like I can't tell what that link is. I have to go into the site and kind of dig into it to find that. The report itself doesn't show me that. So kudos for going down the right path, but they've got some more work to do here to flesh these out. If I look at the other reports in here, the shared with everyone, actually just ran this, so it finished before we came through here. I'm just curious. No, we don't have anyone in that one, but again, it's just looking at the last 28 days. I don't think we use that one in general, so I don't think even our dashboard shows any on that side. And then on the Purview side, we're just starting to roll out sensitivity labels in our own tenants. We're not seeing anything from that perspective. We've applied labels to workspaces, but not to the sites themselves. And there's some licensing changes that just came through that actually makes that easier that I'm going to talk about. So, good start, but more work to be done from that point of view. Obviously, Purview gives you a ton of compliance and security as part of that. It actually gives you a fair bit of oversight onto AI in general in your organization as well. There's actually a browser extension that you can deploy out to all of your users that will watch and see what they're doing from an AI point of view. What sort of chats are they putting into Copilot? What are they putting into ChatGPT publicly and such from that point of view? Sorry, question just came through. Are sensitivity labels the same as data classification? They are related. We're going to talk more about what the labels are in a minute. So maybe we'll just hold that for a second. We'll come back there. But keep the questions coming in chat. Always interested to get feedback from that point of view. So this is the one that got a chuckle from the Stockholm audience, because can you deploy a pilot in 2 to 4 days? That sounds pretty aggressive. Basically, you haven't really looked at your tenant much at all. What you've done is restricted down so that Copilot only sees part of your organization, and I'll talk more about how that happens. And could you deploy it to your whole organization in 2 to 4 weeks? I feel even for us as 25 people, that might be aggressive, and then operate from there. But I think the concept of pilot to deploy at scale does make a lot of sense. And they've published a whole blueprint and white paper around there. There's a lot of content around how you would take this process through. So even if you don't believe the timelines in there, the things that they're calling out to do make a lot of sense. So I do encourage you to dig into that. But we've basically built our own Copilot readiness roadmap of what we're encouraging our clients to go through. And that's what we're going to spend sort of the balance of the session here talking about. Going through the consolidation, inventorying what you have, cleaning, securing, and labeling it, training, not from an AI model training point of view, but change management. Like, this is a big change for people in your organization, and are they going to be using it effectively and responsibly? And then ongoing governance from that point of view. So consolidation, even though we call it as a first step, doesn't have to be a precursor, but just be aware, a lot of our clients still have legacy file shares. They've got on-premise SharePoint that hasn't moved to the cloud yet. By default, Copilot's not going to see that content. You can do things in Microsoft Search to light that up, but really, you should be having a cloud plan in place to say, how do we move that content up into the cloud? And like I said, that doesn't need to be a precursor to doing Copilot, but it's something you should be aware about in terms of what is Copilot going to be able to answer depending on what content is where. But the inventory one is a big one. Understanding what you have today in Microsoft 365 is a big deal. And there's a lot of vendors. You'll see Envision IT is in there. I wanted to be respectful. We're not the only game in town. There's a lot of great long-term vendors. In fact, Lightning Tools, Bind Tuning, Orchestry, we partner quite a bit with. ShareGate we've used for approaching 2 decades now, probably, in terms of their migration tools, but they've also done a good job from a reporting point of view. AvePoint, Rencore, BCC, Syskit all have lots of reporting tools there as well. So, we have our own tenant dashboard that I'm going to dive into here, but by all means, have a look at other vendor solutions as well and understand where they fit in. We're not really looking at the governance side of it. We actually partner with Orchestry and Bind Tuning primarily on that side to say, hey, how do you set up tools to create new sites and manage their life cycle? Really, what we focused on is the inventory and reporting side of it to understand what you've got going on in your tenant. So we've created what we call our Envision IT M365 tenant dashboard, and it's a high-level view in Power BI of what's going on in your tenant. So here, let's come back over to my browser here. I have our dashboard open. Let me actually full screen this against our prod tenant again. Now, I haven't refreshed this since I was in Oslo preparing for the session, but the idea is to refresh this typically on a 5-day schedule, and then make it available on demand that clients can say, hey, I want to do a refresh right now. It took about an hour, 2 hours to run through our tenant, about 1 terabyte of content, 120,000 files. So not massive, but not tiny either. So obviously that will scale depending on the size of your organization. Now, we spent a fair bit of time optimizing this for performance to say, hey, the first time through, it's going to take a long time. But if you've got a bunch of libraries and SharePoint sites and teams that are dormant and inactive and nobody's doing anything with them, we don't need to recrawl them again a day later or 5 days later when we go through from there. Now, the beauty of having this in Power BI is that I can drill into this and I can interact with the visuals that we're seeing on here. So we can see here, a workspace for us is defined as a team site, communication site. So it could be SharePoint, could be Microsoft Teams. We kind of lump them together to say, hey, what are our active versus inactive workspaces? You can see majority of our workspaces are inactive. We've got some house cleaning to do and some archiving and tidying up that we should probably go through. But let's actually focus on the 73 active ones. So I click into that, I've now filtered that down, and I see the 73 workspaces that qualify the, hey, we've done something in the last 90 days with them. And maybe I want to drill deeper just into the teams, and I can see, hey, where is there some anyone links or some new and existing users sharing links across that. And you can see, even though we were seeing 0 links in the SAM reports, there's a lot of links there that we should probably drive into and tidy up. And even our labeling, we've got 8 of those Microsoft Teams labeled as green. I'll talk in a minute about what green means. Let's actually drill into that and understand what those workspaces are. So these are the active workspaces. They shouldn't be green. They should be amber or amber strict, depending on the scenario in there. So this helps us apply the right sensitivity labels to those areas. So let's take a client example. MBN Canada, we do a lot of work with. Megan's actually great about us sharing what we do with them, so I can drill into their workspace details and understand what's happening in that actual workspace. So this particular workspace is a Microsoft team. We can see there's a number of channels in here. Most of those channels are fairly inactive. We should probably, we've marked them as archive. We've actually built an archive tool that'll take a channel and all its conversations and turn it into a Word document that we can just store as a record and get rid of the channel altogether as part of that. So we need to start doing that in our teams and tidying things up from that point of view. We can see the members, owners, visitors, links within this workspace, document activity, what types of documents, so lots of Excels, which isn't surprising because their particular project is about collecting data through Excel from all of their member municipalities across Canada and building a data warehouse around service performance across municipalities. And the main implementation of that project was in 2022, so we can see the bulk of the content happen there, but we're continuing to do work with them through here, so we see that activity. So this is really useful to be able to start at the high level, start to drill down deeper, and understand what's going on from that point of view. I can even drill from a user activity point of view and understand, hey, what members, what guests do I have in my tenant? What sort of activity are we seeing within those? So I can drill into myself. It's kind of cool, actually, because I can see my activity across the world. So here's me up in Oslo. I'm not sure where I was in Germany or Brussels at that time, but I was down in Dallas, Texas, and obviously Newark briefly, most of my activity in Toronto, out in Vancouver. The interesting thing is sometimes you'll see spots in parts of the world that you're not in, and it's a little frightening to understand that your accounts are getting attacked all the time, and there's failed login attempts. I mean, you can't prevent that. It's good to be aware of that from that point of view to say, hey, what were my failures? So I can actually come over to my sign-in failures and understand, for my account in particular, most of these were probably me just abandoning a login, but what actually was going on from that point of view. So providing this all-up view across your organization, even history of new accounts, when have accounts been added over time, what does that look like from that perspective? So we've got a ton of data in here. In fact, if I open it up in Power BI desktop, this is the data model. You can see there's lots of connections between the different things in here. I can drill into individual tables and understand here I'm looking at document permissions, what are all the sharing links and what are the actual files that those were being shared on as part of that. So all that data is there. We're still working on the presentation itself. We've just started running the harvester, which is what we call the tool that extracts all this content from your tenant. We've run it with a number of our bigger clients just in the last week or two. And we're working with them to understand what do we need to put on the dashboard? What are the questions that you want to answer as part of that? So big investment here. We've actually launched this out as its own standalone product. It actually started as a dashboard as part of our external user manager product. And we realized, there's a lot more we can do with it, not just from a user's point of view, but from a workspaces and a documents and sensitivity point of view. Let's roll that in and make it its own product from that point of view. So you can go up on the Envision IT site to this tenant dashboard link and check that out. So, the clean, secure label, obviously you need that view of your tenant to understand what's there. What do I need to delete from a archival or stale content point of view? Because if you've got old stuff there, again, Copilot may not know that, and it'll answer questions with out-of-date content, which you don't want happening from that perspective. Even things like, HR policies on your intranet, if you've got your current policies, but you also got your last 10 years worth of historical policies there, and Copilot starts pulling up the 10-year-old one instead of the current one and answering HR self-service questions as part of that, that's obviously a problem. So you want to understand, can we roll out retention policies and start to archive or delete that old content from that point of view. The security we've talked a lot about in terms of making sure that the right permissions are there, and the labeling is really around those sensitivity labelings and how that works. So Purview, like I said, does a lot of things, but really, what we want to really dive into is the sensitivity level side of it. And when people hear labels in Purview, they often think of retention labels, which are defining the life cycle for records. If you're a public sector organization, they have very strict rules around how long content needs to be retained from a freedom of information and privacy point of view, and what happens, after a certain period of time has elapsed. Does it get moved into a long-term storage? Does it get deleted for privacy reasons? What is compliance around that? And those file plans around retention labels can be huge. They can have hundreds of labels in them. That can be overwhelming for people to get their head around. Sensitivity labels around the how sensitive content is. These labels should be quite simple, and we become a fan of what's called the traffic light protocol, which is something the UK government started about 20 years ago to say, hey, can we have a very simple 3-tier information protection labeling policy? Green, amber, red. Very easy for people to understand. Low, medium, high. In fact, we've started implementing Purview with a public health agency here in Canada. They're mandated to follow a similar pattern, but they call it low, medium, high. It's basically the same idea, just a different name for it. And it's really important to understand that those labels and the names are easy for people to get their head around. Sometimes they'll have labels like sensitive, confidential, and top secret. Well, how do those relate to each other? Like, which is more important than another? Whereas a low, medium, high, green, amber, red, it's immediately obvious to virtually everybody that red or high is more sensitive than green or low. And there's different controls around this. I give a whole talk around TLP and sensitivity labels and some recommendations we have around conditional access policies and security controls and encryption and things like that go along with that. From a Copilot point of view, it's more important just to have Copilot understand what's the level of sensitivity of content that it's ingesting as part of its answer to somebody's question. But you should leverage the opportunity to also put the right information protection in from that perspective. And these can be manually applied, defaults can be applied, or you can use what's called AI-powered classifiers to actually look for content. So, look for patterns like a Ontario health number, which is a standard format number that every Ontario citizen gets, that would be a trigger to say that's probably personal health information and we should classify that data appropriately. Or a 16-digit credit card number, which does include a check digit, and there's some rules around what a valid credit card number is. It can look for that and say, hey, that should probably be PCI, personal credit information, high sensitivity from that point of view. So AI can start to do some of that labeling automatically for you. But I've been a fan of just using default labels with document libraries for some time now. The challenge was that you always needed an E5 license, which is the top tier Microsoft license to do that. Not all of our clients have that. A lot of them have E3, which is always you need to get into Purview and compliance, but it doesn't give you the default and auto labeling from that point of view. So there was an interesting dialogue happening at Ignite around SharePoint Advanced Management. So SAM gives you the ability to assign default labels to the library. So you can say, hey, for this SharePoint site, it's an amber or a medium sensitivity site. Every document that gets added or edited in there, automatically apply that amber label to it. In the past, you needed a top E5 license to do that. If you have SharePoint Advanced Management, you can now do that as part of that. Now, when they announced SharePoint Advanced Management, it was an additional $3 per user per month that you had to license for your tenant. And you had to license 100% of your users. You couldn't just do some subset, even if those were frontline workers. So there could be a significant cost even for SAM from that point of view. But the key is they understand SAM is a good unblocker for Copilot, so they decided, hey, if you get at least one Copilot license in your tenant, then you get SAM for your entire tenant, and you can do all this stuff as part of that. It's still rolling out, so it's going to be January to March before that's actually available in your tenant, but you can sign up for a free trial right now. And even if your trial expires because it's only valid for a month, just renew it for one user. Pay the $1 $3 license. Microsoft's not going to beat you up and say, hey, you're supposed to pay $3 for every user in your tenant, because they're actually trying to figure out how to refund people who are paying for it that have Copilot that don't actually need it now. So this is all kind of in flux, but the net, get a trial, get SAM, only pay for one user going forward until Microsoft gets their licensing sorted and rolled out. And yes, you get the reporting, not entirely useful in my opinion just yet, but you will also get the default sensitivity labels, which is really important. Okay, I know I'm getting tight on time. I've only got 5 minutes left here, so I'm going to pick the pace up a little bit. Going through the reports to understand that, we've kind of looked at those from that point of view, and we went into the data access governance reports and sharing links, so I can kind of skip through those pieces. This is an important topic, though. There's two things. One's called restricted access control. The other is restricted content discovery. This is kind of Microsoft's way to get Copilot going quickly. They say, hey, maybe your permissions are a mess, or maybe they're not, but you're just not sure. We're just going to restrict down what search and Copilot has access to a smaller set of sites. What this does is it means that my general search, so if I'm in the root of my tenant, let me just pop out of here for a second. And I do a search here organizationally wide, I won't see everything in the organization. I would only see the things that are restricted access. So it's going to hamper the search experience, but it's going to mean that Copilot isn't going to light up things that maybe it shouldn't, or we haven't had a chance to properly determine whether it should or shouldn't. Now, if I'm deeper down, like I'm in that marketing site and I do a search here, it kind of ignores that rule. It says, hey, you're in a specific site. I will search everything in the site, even though there might be some restricted access controls against that. It'll still let me use search in those contexts. So it's kind of a mix. It's going to change some of the search experience. It's going to make Copilot a little safer in the short term. It is very much a short-term solution, excuse me, if you want to light up Copilot in your organization. So it's something. The other one, discovery, it's kind of similar, but it's more focused on Copilot to say, hey, that discovery of content will only have a short-term solution while you get your tenant as a whole in better shape to manage things from that perspective. There are other reports in Purview that you can look for oversharing and data loss prevention. We don't have time here today into that. I want to keep going through the readiness plan. I know we're almost out of time here. So I mentioned training, things like use cases and prompt engineering. How do you use an AI prompt is not something everybody understands how to be effective with. And there's great resources from Microsoft. There's learning pathways you can actually deploy in. There's things in Viva Insights that you can use as part of that. There's actually lots of cool resources from that perspective. And then from a governance point of view, sort of an ongoing care and feeding, looking at what's happening in Viva Insights from an AI usage point of view, looking at Purview, there's a reporting there from that point of view, and obviously third-party tools from that perspective. So you can see Copilot adoption going on in your organization through the Copilot reports. You can even drill deeper and see the prompts that people are using and how successful they're being from that point of view. There's some privacy stuff. I'm not entirely sure. I need to dig in and understand, particularly for our European clients, how things are working from that point of view. But you can see the activities and AI interactions that people are having within your organization. Okay, so just to wrap up, back to those takeaways that we had at the beginning of the session. AI is coming, you can't stop it, but you can sort of embrace it and understand what it means in your organization. And you really need to be prepared for it. and understand, yeah, you can do the restricted access controls and restricted content discovery in the short term to be a little safer to turn on Copilot earlier, but you really need to look at your tenant as a whole and understand your sharing and your information protection side. So get your reporting going, get your analysis going from that perspective. So as I mentioned, we've been lighting up the harvester and getting going on the tenant dashboard with a number of our clients already. If you're interested in that, it's actually a pretty easy onboarding process. We've built a ability for you to come in as an administrator, consent to the tool. We take care of doing the harvesting, setting up the Power BI report for you, and then we give you access to it from the new year.